Multi-Hazards, all about protecting communities.
Hi, everybody. Again, we're here for Multi-Hazards, a podcast where we take a deep dive into issues of emergency management, climate change adaptation, security, etc. And at the end of the day, it's about protection, protecting communities. And welcome to you. I'm the host, Vin Nelson. Today's topic is about climate change adaptation, and I am privileged to have Dr. Stewart Cohen here with us today. Now, he's virtually a neighbor. He lives about 45 minutes drive away from here in Greater Vancouver, Canada. So yeah, there's about 3 plus million of us here in Greater Vancouver. That's nothing compared to a lot of cities, but hey, he's my neighbor. So I will give you his bio right here, right now. So, Stewart J. Cohen is an author and educator on human-caused climate change. His university education was in geography, obtaining degrees from McGill University, the University of Alberta, and the University of Illinois. So he is recently retired from a 35-year research career with Environment and Climate Change Canada. He began his career in Toronto, where he created and led studies on the impacts of projected climate change throughout Canada, including the Great Lakes, Saskatchewan River, and the Mackenzie Basin. In 1995, as part of a research partnership agreement with the University of British Columbia, UBC, he moved to Vancouver and began developing collaborative projects with the UBC community. He led several climate change impact and adaptation studies of the Okanagan region, and we'll talk about that during our podcast, and contributed to studies on forests in central and northern British Columbia, and on projected climate impacts and adaptation actions in the Vancouver area. Yay, Vancouver. He also created and taught a graduate course, Climate Change in the 21st Century. This led him to publishing a textbook with that title in 2009, and it was published by McGill-Queen's University Press. So Dr. Cohen has been a member of author teams for national assessments of climate change in Canada and the United States, as well as several publications of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, Working Group 2, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. Dr. Cohen is currently a part-time instructor on climate change adaptation at Royal Roads University, and that's quite near us. It's on Vancouver Island near Victoria, and is writing posts on his blog, www.drclimatechange.com. So it's my custom here, my tradition at this podcast, because of deep respect for First Nations and other Indigenous peoples on whose land I podcast, here in the suburbs of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, to say a territorial acknowledgement. So this text that I use, it's from Kwantlen Polytechnic University, or KPU. Here we go. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. So these are the names of various First Nations groups who are indigenous to this area around Greater Vancouver here on the west coast of Canada. So, without further ado, let's get to the interview. So good morning, Dr. Cohen. Stewart Cohen is here at Multi-Hazards Podcast, and we're honored to have him to talk about climate change adaptation, among many other things. So how are you today, Stewart? Can I call you Stewart?
Oh, sure, Vin. And it's great to be here on this podcast.
Okay, great. Now, I've read a lot about you online, and much of your work has been on what we now call climate change adaptation. So in past decades, it was simply labeled environmental or sustainability work. And I believe that there was a point in time where the word climate change adaptation became used more frequently. So I'm just wondering if you can give us a recap on what exactly is climate change adaptation.
Well, let's start with adaptation itself, which is being able to respond to an experience that you've had, and so you change the way you're doing something. And when it comes to climate, I think people have always been adapting to climate. Our ancestors certainly did over centuries and millennia. But that was always adaptation based on historic experience. Climate change adaptation is different because now we're trying to think ahead on the basis of projections of future climate that come from climate models, mathematical and scientific representations of the future climate, which modelers have been using to generate projections of future climate if we continue to change the chemistry of the atmosphere and carbon dioxide concentrations continue to increase. So this future warming creates a real challenge for a whole range of climate sensitive things, forests, water, food, ecosystems, public health, and ultimately communities, businesses, countries. So trying to be proactive and anticipatory about that depends on our ability to translate this future climate warming into a sense of how things are going to change. Is future warming going to be good or bad, and in what way? And so you do these studies of future impacts, you get a sense of this future damage report if you don't change what you're doing, if you don't change how you manage water or the size of your sewer pipes or the snow loads that your buildings can handle or any of these other things. And so that damage report gives you a sense of what you need to adapt to. And then you think about, well, how would I change these designs and these regulations and anything else to anticipate this change in a future climate? And how well would that adaptation work? And that's still a model-based exercise because you're still talking about the future. So this whole exercise of trying to frame and define and plan for a future climate, how we're adapting to it, it's a very different kind of challenge from adapting on the basis of an observed historical experience, an observed flood, drought, heat wave. You've got that observation, you've assessed what went right and what went wrong with those particular events, and you determine what you need to do better if that same event comes along so that it doesn't damage you so much. But a climate change adaptation means you're doing all of this on the basis of a model projected future. So it's a different kind of exercise. You're still trying to reduce your vulnerability, you're still trying to reduce your risk, but you're doing it on the basis of a projection rather than on an observed historic extreme event.
Right.
So that's what makes this very different from things that our ancestors and previous generations used to do.
Right. And just for the listeners, just a little point here. Weather is what we see outside our window at any given time, but climate is at least 30 years record of weather in any given location. So that's right, Dr. Cohen, Stewart, right?
Well, the standard for establishing climate statistics, like what is your average and what is your extreme event, a couple standard deviations above or below something, the standard tends to be 30 years. We have seen on other occasions averages established on the basis of shorter periods like 20 years, but I think climate agencies would prefer to have 30 years or more in order to establish averages and statistics.
Right. Now, from an education point of view, I've found from online searches that any courses on climate change adaptation are extremely rare, even especially online courses. I think, for example, Lund University in Sweden, they have a climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction masters. And Australia right now, I think it's Griffith University. There's maybe starting a climate change adaptation masters. There's a master's of climate change. It's kind of a general one from University of Waterloo in Canada, but it's kind of hard to find online. But I came up with Royal Roads University on Vancouver Island here on the west coast of Canada. You are teaching a course right now on climate change adaptation. So I'm wondering if you could tell us what that entails.
Well, sure. So Royal Roads approached me last fall, the fall of 2019, to work on something like this with them, because Royal Roads itself wants to establish a larger program on climate change adaptation, both a certificate program and a master's program. But they needed something at the beginning up front, and they wanted something of a relatively short duration, 4 weeks, that could be tailored towards the adult learner, and in particular the practitioner, a person who's already working as a planner or an engineer or forester and so on. So we came up with this 4-week, very brief but hopefully rich program of climate change science, which is the first module. What can climate science tell us about trends, and also about how projections of future climate are created, the scenarios that we talk about. And then the second module being focused on impacts. So if the world warms, what does that mean for water and forests and so on? Because that tells us why we need to adapt. Because if warming was a good thing, we wouldn't worry nearly so much about it. But we find that when we do these impact studies, usually it creates a real problem for a whole lot of things, whether it's expansion of forest pests or increases in wildfire risk or flood risk and the like. So that's what the second module will focus on, is the impacts. And then the third module looks at adaptation, the idea that you take these impacts and you try to plan for them in an iterative risk management approach, which is not that different, I think, from how risks are managed today, but it's just that this time climate scenarios become an explicit input. Right. So now your planning cycle is for a future climate that is different from past experience, as opposed to your planning on the basis of a historic observation. So the third module covers that and includes some discussion about places where communities have actually tried to do this already. So we have some early examples where we can observe what they have done and how they have done it. And then the fourth module, we asked the class to, each student to say, have you got something on your desk right now that you would either like to incorporate climate change adaptation into, or you've already started to do that, and can you share that with the rest of the class? So wow. That's the course. And we've done 2 of these sessions so far. We did one in February, and we just finished one in May. And we will do another one in October. So if anyone's interested in that, they can go to Royal Roads University and look up the course. It's called Climate Change Adaptation Fundamentals. We'll be running it for 4 weeks next October.
Okay, sounds wonderful. Now, you've been blogging also, I've seen online, as Dr. Climate Change. So how did this come about?
Yeah, drclimatechange.com. Well, so I had just retired after 35 years doing research with the Canadian government, Environment and Climate Change Canada, which used to be called Environment Canada, and working for the federal government as a government scientist. There was only so much that you could talk about in public when it came to climate change. You could talk about the specifics of your own science work, but you couldn't really engage in the broader aspects of the issue, including those that touch on policy. Mm-hmm. And I kind of promised myself that once I retired, I really wanted to engage in this public discussion that covers the breadth of the issue, not just the science, but what are the implications of the science for the policy debate and being able to figure out policy choices. And I thought that initially the best way for me to do that was to create a blog. And so I created Dr. Climate Change almost immediately after I retired. And there's two kinds of posts that I put on there. One is longer posts on particular topics that I call a snowball's chance. And if you understand what the meaning of a snowball's chance is, it's kind of a self-deprecating idea that this is the chance I think I have of actually influencing what's going on.
Okay.
But I'm doing it anyway. And then the second set of posts is what I call what it is, what it isn't. So I take a particular topic like, say, carbon pricing, where there seems to be some misunderstanding about what that is. Could be carbon pricing, could be carbon offsets, could be a particular thing that's been written about by someone who's well known in the media. And I want to assess that thing and come to a conclusion about what it actually is. And if it's being misinterpreted or not correctly viewed, then I answer the what it isn't part of it. So those are the two kinds of posts that I'm doing right now. And there's certainly, the climate change issue is just so broad. There's so many layers to it. There's lots to write about. And so I've been doing that now since last September, and it's been interesting. It's been a great learning experience. So I expect I'll continue to do that for a while.
Okay, well, I gotta tell you a secret. I'm working on a podcast. I'm trying to release it maybe today or tomorrow, but you may be interested. It's about projecting future government models and or systems of governance that would best adapt to climate change. So maybe you can blog on that in the next few weeks. Just it's called Climate Leviathan. So anyways, that will be coming out soon. So anyways, next question. I'm just wondering now, I know in the early days, I think it was like the late 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the word mitigation was the word bandied about by the United Nations when it came to climate change. And then in recent years, finally, there's the word adaptation. Now, I remember, I think it was a year ago in Quebec, there was a high school student who complained on social media and said, look, the Quebec government is giving us students in grade 11 or 12. They're saying, how can we adapt to climate change? And this high school student was kind of offended. They were saying, well, look, the government has given up on dealing with climate change, on decarbonizing the globe and dealing with mitigation. Now they've moved on to adaptation. So what are we, the youth of today, supposed to think of that? And he can't remember what happened, but it was quite offended, right? We're working on adaptation now, are we? But it is very important to think about adaptation. So there's mitigation, there's adaptation. So I'm wondering which side you would weigh in on more these days.
Well, the short answer is we need to do both. The longer answer is mitigation being the activity where we're trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is one where success isn't guaranteed because you need 8 billion people to cooperate. Billions of people and thousands of businesses and hundreds of national governments, you need them all to cooperate. And although awareness of the problem is higher now than it's ever been, the challenge of actually getting everyone in the planet to cooperate with this isn't certainly not guaranteed, which is why in the climate change world, we're always working with scenarios, and there's always scenarios plural. Nobody knows how the world is going to use energy, coal, oil, natural gas, and the renewables, wind, solar, biofuels, as well as geothermal, and throw nuclear in for that matter. Nobody knows how that's going to happen because predicting future planetary technological changes and energy system changes and economic changes and changes in trading patterns, you can't know this. Nobody can know this. So people who study this for as much as they can work out different possible paths to the future. And that's why you have scenarios plural. You have high emission scenarios and low emission scenarios and various ones in between. And so when we end up going through the entire process of predicting future climate and then predicting future climate impacts and how we need to adapt to them, we're going to have several of these stories where we need to think about how we reduce our vulnerabilities, our exposures, and our risks to high, medium, and low emissions cases. So adaptation will be important precisely because we don't know if we're going to be successful at reducing emissions. But adaptation is not an excuse to avoid that challenge of, how do we reduce the amount of carbon we're emitting into the atmosphere? So we obviously need to do both. And as we do that, and if we're conscious about it, we're explicit about it in our planning, then that gets us close to ideas, for example, of low carbon resilience, which I know you've spoken about in earlier podcasts. Can we adapt to climate change without having to increase our carbon footprint to do so? Or can we reduce emissions without inadvertently increasing the risk of something else from happening? So you have these trade-offs between the two, which I think are very important to make explicit and as quantitative as possible in the planning that we're doing at a national level, at a local level, and certainly scaled up. So being able to think about climate change as a portfolio challenge, where we have to do both of these things, and we always have to communicate that we're doing both of these things, that it's not an either or. I think the student that you're talking about probably felt or was afraid that the government was shifting from one to the other. Whether that was strictly a communication error or not, I don't know. But I think we always have to be careful, whether we're in government or in academia or in non-government organizations or in universities or in fields of practice, doesn't matter. I think we have to be consistent with this message that we convey, that in order to manage climate change, we have to do both things. We have to do mitigation of emissions, and we have to adapt to whatever comes. We have to pay attention to both of these things, both as individual actions, but also as how they interact with each other and how they influence the other planning objectives that we all have around the economy and health and personal security and all these other things. So I think we have to be consistent about conveying that message, that climate change response has got to be about both things. So I certainly hope that the youth who are becoming very interested in this will understand that message too, and hopefully people in our generation will be consistent in communicating to them that we're not giving up reducing carbon when we talk about adaptation. That's certainly not the intent. We want to do both, but we have to pay attention to both.
Right. Okay. Now, my great-grandfather was a Danish immigrant. He came to Canada many, many years ago. And he came to an area that you studied, the Okanagan, which it's about 5-6 hours drive straight east from Vancouver and the west coast here in British Columbia. And I know you did a big research project there for a while. And I'm just very curious on what you did there in the Okanagan.
Sure. So I moved to Vancouver in 1995 from Toronto. I had started my career with Environment Canada in Toronto and had done a number of regional scale climate change impact studies that revolved around water issues, including lakes and in the Saskatchewan River, and also in Northwest Territories and Northeast BC, Northern Alberta, the whole Mackenzie River Basin. So arriving in Vancouver to start working here, I was interested in how climate change would influence water supply and demand, water management. And I was beginning to meet people here who raised the concerns about the Okanagan as a place that is already stressed. It's a semi-arid region, a growing population, very intensive agriculture, concerns about freshwater ecosystems, fisheries, but that there hadn't really been any climate change work done there yet. And would I consider trying to apply whatever experience I had in working in other parts of the country to starting something in the Okanagan region? So back in, I think, late 1999 or early 2000, I put together a proposal that included some people from the University of British Columbia and also some local colleagues from Environment Canada to do a small study on what would happen to the hydrology, which is the stream flow in the watershed, but also what that kind of information, a projection of future hydrology, what the implications might mean to future water management issues there. And so that involved reaching out to local knowledge holders, local practitioners from provincial governments, from municipalities like Kelowna, the Okanagan Nations Alliance. I reached out to them, the Fruit Growers Association, the Water Supply Association, those that had important local knowledge. You had quite a strong water community in the Okanagan. They're all very well networked. And the water board there, the Okanagan Basin Water Board, is also very active in managing water issues. And so I wanted to do some hydrology and then present this to local knowledge holders in a form of discussions and focus groups and the like to get their feedback on what they thought the implications of this might be. And so that initial conversation concluded in 2001, and it definitely raised a lot of interest. And so I got approached by some people from the region later that year, said, can we do another phase of this, but let's make it bigger and more ambitious. And so we did a second phase. We managed to get some grant funding from the federal government. And so now we were able to address demand issues quantitatively. So we looked at crop water demand, urban water demand, implications for fisheries, although we didn't quantify that, but we certainly wanted to include it in some way, but also new hydrologic work and several more scenarios and incorporate potential population growth. That raised a lot of local attention, including attention from the water board that we're thinking of a long-term sustainable water strategy. And so that second phase was pretty well received, and so there was encouragement to be a little more experimental with a third phase. I had a graduate student at the university that wanted to create a decision support tool.
Okay.
And this decision support tool was an opportunity to play some scenario games with this. So if you could model the system in some reasonably simple way, you could model where the stocks of water are, where water's collected, and where the flows are, which is the demand. So you're pulling water out of one stock and you're sending it down into the lake and downstream, but you're using water from that stock for something, for irrigation or for watering your lawns, or you're setting aside water for fish. So this decision support tool was built with the assistance of local knowledge holders. So we spent an entire year doing this model building workshop where we had people from the community who were professionals in water management and in engineering and so on, who provided input to this graduate student to produce this model. And so the end result of that was we were able to present a third sort of final report in 2007, which laid out the range of challenges and opportunities to adapt. Now I feel pretty good about that whole experience, because with all the local engagement in this, what happened was local knowledge holders and local water authorities, including the water board, took ownership of this issue, and they've been carrying it ever since.
Right.
And so research on water supply, water demand, how to look ahead with climate change adaptation, this is all now being led by them. And I think this is what you want as an outcome of a research project like this. The legacy isn't just the reports. It's right. The experience that people in practice and local knowledge holders and governments get from that. And if they take ownership of this issue, then they're the ones that are going to create the adaptation plans and also carry them out, the implementation of those plans. So there is, I think, a great example of science-enabled decision-making on climate change adaptation. So I thought it was a really great experience, and appreciate very much the opportunity to work there and to work with some very smart people who understood water issues in the Okanagan really well.
Right. And just for our international listeners, this place is called Okanagan. It is right on the 49th parallel, which is the border between Canada and U.S. for a lot of the land division between the United States and Canada. And there's actually the only desert in Canada. That's what they bill themselves as, right near Osoyoos, which is in the Okanagan. And it creeps up from, I guess it's from California, Nevada, up through Oregon and Washington states, and then into the little part called Osoyoos there. So the Okanagan is quite dry. There's a lot of wineries now growing grapes, and they've also had quite a few forest fires around that region from lightning strikes, or maybe it's people having barbecues or whatever. So you can see in the news every year there are some effects that come from a warming climate out of the Okanagan. So it's quite a sensitive area, and in British Columbia, it's very well known. So yeah, I'm wondering, so in British Columbia, we have learned some climate change adaptation lessons. So I'm wondering which lessons we could offer to the rest of the world, and then perhaps what lessons do we need to learn from, say, similar areas, like similar geographic areas in the rest of the world?
Well, I think what we can offer and also what we can learn is really about process, as opposed to specifics about whether a particular trickle drip irrigation technology is better here than it is there, or something like that. I don't have the expertise on those technological areas, but my role in the Okanagan work and in some of the other work that I did while I was doing research was to try to create the frame whereby knowledge sharing could be initiated, could be maintained, sustained, and hopefully after the actual study is over, that there would be a legacy of that would continue. So process, I think, is really important, process of knowledge generation and knowledge creation. And that knowledge about climate change has to be multi-scalar, because you're starting with global scale and you're trying to translate that down to regional and local level. So there's challenges with that. Climate change is very much multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. So you may be starting with atmospheric science, which in itself, in this context, is a client of another community that is looking at global energy demand and is trying to come up with different scenarios of how emissions are going to change. So you've got these energy modelers, and then you've got atmospheric scientists, and then you've got people who are engaged in these impact assessments, which is how are you translating these climate science indicators into something on the ground. So people who study water flows, the hydrologists, people who study agriculture, the agrologists, agronomists, people who study forestry, not just the biologists who understand forest growth, but also those who understand pests and fire risks and invasive species. So in all these areas, you've got information moving from one discipline to another, and then ultimately reaching a point where you've got information that is actionable, which means there's got to be something there that lets you put this in front of planners and economists and engineers and those that actually design responses and implements them in government, local or provincial or higher scale, or in the private sector. So interdisciplinary, this knowledge transfer across disciplines also becomes really, really important. And then it's not just disciplines also, but it's also very much an intercultural thing too. In Canada, we have had to learn how to engage with local knowledge holders from First Nations. And they have very important experiences, fire management, forest management, for example, fisheries. So being able to share knowledge across cultures is also a hugely important part of this. So the knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer process across scales, across disciplines, across cultures, and it benefiting from historic experience, but very much having to be future focused, which means it's scenario based. So understanding how to do this process well, it's a moving target. I think we're getting better at it. And I think there are a number of examples in BC where we have seen adaptation planning and implementation that has understood this knowledge transfer process. And I think that's a useful thing that people in British Columbia can share with others. But I think we are also learning too, whether we're in BC or anywhere else, how do you do this well, and how do you sustain it over the long term so that it's not an ephemeral activity? It can't just be starting and ending on the basis of an individual research grant. It has to be something that's always happening. It has to become part of the business as usual of practitioners in the private sector and in government, and also the decision makers in the private sector and in government. So if this becomes the business as usual, if this becomes the new standard for fields of practice in the private sector and government, then I think that we will all be in a better place to manage future climate change risks, to be efficient and effective about it.
Right. And it just brought to mind, there's a sentence that a lot of people use when they're talking about climate change online or in webinars or in lectures. They say it's all hands on deck. I guess that's a shipping or pirate word. So and you're saying that it means that all means First Nations of Canada, settlers, people from all different disciplines, people from different geographic regions. It's everybody getting involved to solve this one problem.
Well, it's a problem with a lot of layers, and it's a very big problem. And climate change isn't alone in this kind of, let's call it the longitudinal aspect of it, where I think our planet as a whole, whether we're thinking about the planet as a whole or countries or cities, we have to think about how we take on something like this and first understand it and own it and respond to it in the most effective way possible. And it challenges everything about what we do. So I think about what we're going through right now with the virus pandemic, COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking about the parallels between our experience with COVID-19 and our experience with human-caused climate change. So how does both of these issues start? They both start with a communication from science where something new is happening which has the potential to challenge business and life as usual, as we know it. Now, the two of them are operating on very, very different speeds. We've been thinking about COVID-19 for just a few months. You know, the first science observation that we knew about at the time was the end of December, early January. An observation was made in Wuhan, some mysterious illness and virus. They didn't know what it was. You start doing some tests and you come up to the conclusion that there is a new virus, which looked like an old SARS virus, but it's a new virus. And they gave it a name, COVID-19. And that uncertain science information made its way eventually to a national government in China, to the United Nations, at the World Health Organization. They started putting out bulletins in the third week of January. That's just 3 weeks after the first observation. I mean, can you imagine? We are worried about them being too slow, and yet it was just 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. And then between that period of time at the end of January and just 2 months later, you had the entire planet on a lockdown. Travel canceled, people told to stay home, businesses stopping, economies stopping in the space of just, weeks. And yet even then you had critics saying this was way too slow. But it still started from a science message, and it took that long to get to the point where governments felt that they could take away people's freedom of mobility. I mean, this is a really huge ask. Now compare that with climate change. Climate change also started off with a message from science, something unfamiliar to the general public, that if we continue to pollute the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases, eventually the world would warm, and that warming would hurt all of us. But that science message actually started being published in the late 1800s. Right. The Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius published his paper in 1896.
Mm-hmm.
And you had a few other scientists who were talking about this before World War I and then after World War I. And then after World War II, you had a new generation that was revisiting this and saying, we really need to measure what's going on here. And so Charles Keeling set up his observatory at the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii in 1958 to actually measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, picked a remote place that was far away from big cities and big industries, populations, and said, if CO2 is increasing here and we're far away from the big cities, then this is proof that our collective use of fossil fuels is changing not just the atmosphere in the cities, but the atmosphere of the entire planet. And so he started his measurements in 58. Within just a couple of years, he could see a clear trend. CO2 was going up. It was like the ramping up of the COVID-19 infections curve also was going straight up, which was ultimately leading governments to do what they did to shut down travel. So when Keeling's observations became widely known, you began to see more and more discussions about what that meant for temperature and climate. It took a while before you saw the first generation of three-dimensional global climate models, but they started to come out late 70s and early 80s. The moment those were produced and published, it brought out people like me, and this is when I started, was in 1984, to say, can I do some what-if studies of this and say, what does this mean to water? And others would say, what does this mean to wheat? And others would say, what does this mean to malaria? And so during the 80s, you ended up with this ramping up of information about the potential damage of this warming. And that's what led to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was signed in 1992. Fast forward to where we are now in 2019. We've had a whole lot of these conversations about how do we manage climate change. We have the Paris Agreement, and yet CO2 is still ramping up, and we still have a lot of challenges to climate change action, because what the science message is doing is it's challenging business as usual, which is the burning of fossil fuels, which has generated lots of jobs and economic growth and has improved the quality of life for an awful lot of people. So it's a very entrenched industry, and a lot of people really like it and really want to protect it. So you've got that here, which means we're still having this really difficult challenge in getting countries of the world to get serious about reducing emissions decades and decades after the original science message came out. Whereas with COVID-19, the moment you saw the deaths, you had the entire planet going on a lockdown within a couple of months of the first observation of a virus. So you got two situations, both global, both starting with science, but ultimately leading to a very different rate of responses. And so when I think about all hands on deck, it is that in climate change, we need to learn from the experience of COVID-19 that the way all countries got together to do this was because they immediately saw that there was a reason for them to be involved. There was a clear indicator, COVID-19 deaths, which meant we're going to have to do this. We're actually going to have to tell our people that they're not allowed to travel. And people actually accepted this because they saw this clear indication. There are deaths. People are dying. So they all went along with it. They didn't fight back. And so with climate change, we have to figure out how to do a better job at communicating the reason why countries and businesses and people have to reduce their emissions and have to do it much more quickly than they are. We really have to bring this issue right down to the level where people live, where businesses operate. And as much as we have tried to communicate this over time, there's still a big chunk of the population that hasn't gotten that message very well. So we still need to do a better job at communicating how these risks are increasing to a fairly substantial community that either doesn't understand it or doesn't want to hear it because they want to protect the fossil fuel industry so much because it's something that they feel so closely to. So that's this all hands on deck part, which we still haven't solved yet, is being able to convince people who are very wedded to the fossil fuel industry that we really need you to be a partner in this because emissions need to be managed better. And they need to this needs to happen very quickly.
Right. It reminds me of a of an Upton Sinclair quote that I had read a few months ago, and I'm just trying to think. I believe it's a writer, and he said, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." So, you alluded to that, Stuart, that some people they don't want to get it because if they get it, it's sacrificing their corporation, their way of life, their whole industry, and the bigger picture of the whole planet suffering because of global warming, climate change is just not on the radar screen. So it's
Yeah,
a
but this is
very
why I think
serious thing.
that's why I think there has to be a much better way of framing this conversation rather than the adversarial one that seems to have emerged.
Hmm.
Uh, we're
Us
not
versus
going to,
them, conservative versus liberal.
yeah, we're not going to succeed at this unless you have this some way of getting through this polarization that's going on between
Right.
conservative and liberal, between environmentalists and fossil fuel supporters. If we don't work together and we don't share our information in a respectful and pragmatic way, then we're not going to succeed. And so we need to frame this conversation as one where the fossil fuel industry and its investors and the people who work for them are seen as potential partners in the solution. That if their industry is going to have to be transformed, they need to have a role in this transformation so that they see their jobs changing and their investments changing, as opposed to their investments going to zero and their jobs being lost. I mean, those are two very, very different frames. As long as they see a message coming from those who are concerned about climate change that we simply want the industry to stop, then the very natural reaction is going to be that they're going to fight it. And they've been fighting it, and they've been fighting it very hard, whether it's financially or with court challenges or supporting political parties who are there to actually fight against any serious climate change policy. We have to change this framing. And I'd say the only way this is going to work is if there is a serious discussion about making everyone feel that we are all in this together, because if we're not, then it's simply not going to work. This is what happened with COVID-19. You're seeing countries now experiencing high death rates because they didn't respond when others responded earlier. So this wave is still going through other countries, Brazil and Russia, after it went through Europe and North America. So we all have to cooperate in this because we don't have the vaccine here, and we don't have the magic bullet and the magic button with climate change either. And that's just the deck of cards that we've been dealt in both situations. And we're going to have to take this seriously. And it won't work unless we are all collaborating and cooperating and being respectful of the science.
Right, exactly. Now, if we look at ourselves, we're in June 2020. Now, what do you think right now that national, provincial, or state or municipal governments, what do they need to prioritize right now and in the coming couple of years?
Well, I think they have to enable all of us to be part of both things, to be part of reducing emissions and to be part of planning to adapt. So the part about reducing emissions is it's one thing to say we want to use less fossil fuels, but as consumers, most of us have no capability of using less fossil fuels. The marketplace doesn't let us do it. It doesn't give us choice. We are using carbon every time it's not just every time we drive a car, but every time we buy a pair of shoes or we buy a new cell phone or a new article of clothing. There is carbon embedded in all of that because of the supply chains. But we have no choice as consumers to reduce our carbon footprint because we're not informed about what those carbon footprints are. If you had 3 pairs of shoes that looked roughly the same, and you knew how much carbon was required to produce each of those pairs of shoes, and if at the same time there was, let's say, a carbon price that was a clear signal saying, well, this shoe has a higher carbon price than that pair of shoes because the carbon footprint's higher than here than there, you could, as a consumer, choose the pair of shoes with a lower carbon footprint. You would be empowered as a consumer to reduce your carbon footprint because you're informed about it. So we have that information when it comes to cars, and the government can make it easier by making it easier for us to get first hybrid cars and then electric cars, and having electric charging stations out there in quantity so that we're not afraid of running out of electric power when we're in the middle of a highway. So there are governments that are enabling the change in the fleet of cars. So that's going to happen pretty soon. We're going to see more electric cars. We're going to see more electric charging stations. But the rest of the carbon footprint of our lifestyles needs to be addressed too, in all manners of consumer goods, whether it's electronics or clothing or plastics or food or anything else. There's carbon footprints associated with all of those things. So if we as consumers were better informed about that, then we would be able to make choices with our money to the things we purchase to reduce our personal carbon footprints that way. So that's the mitigation part. The adaptation part, well, I think what we were just talking about was how you get local knowledge holders to see the role that they have in reducing vulnerabilities and risks to climate change where they live. So whether it comes to water or forests or coastal zone properties and flood risks, things like that, I think we all have a role in contributing to the conversation about how we can best reduce our exposures to climate change that way. And so you've got municipal governments that do plans, provincial governments that do plans. They talk about things like setbacks from coastlines or fire smart kinds of policies like you have in British Columbia, where you've got specific rules around if you're going to build housing in the middle of a forested area, this so-called urban forest interface, there has to be some rules to reduce the fire risk on your house. So that aspect of adaptation should be enabled too by governments, again, to make it easier for all of us to live in areas where the exposure we have is not as high as it might otherwise be to wildfire and flood or to heat waves, for example. So I think that's what I think is a priority for all levels of government, to enable us to be part of adaptation and mitigation actions.
Right. And in a conversation before, you told me about climate change information supply chain, and I think you've just alluded to it. So wonder, what exactly is this?
Well, supply chain, not change.
Chain. Oh, sorry. Chain, yes.
Which is, how does information move from one part of the assembly line to the other? So I was earlier in our discussion talking about how scenarios begin with global energy modelers who tell us, well, here are different stories of the world using a lot of fossil fuels or very few fossil fuels and something in between. So we get scenarios of energy consumption production, which become scenarios of emissions, which then the climate modelers take and they run a number of different model simulations of future climate, high, medium, and low emissions. And it's not just one climate modeling group that does that, like the group in Canada, but there's at least a couple of dozen climate modeling groups around the world who are all trying to do this. So we have this array of climate scenario data sets available, different amounts of warming and changes in rainfall and so on. And then that moves on to the next step in the chain, which is the folks who understand hydrology and forestry and forest fire risks and flood risks and drought risks and heat waves and malaria, and what that potentially means to the engineered infrastructures like dams and stormwater sewers and then public health issues, and then potentially moving into the economics of this, which is the exposure of property to damage and what that means for insurance and what that means for investment in property. So this whole supply chain moving through these various steps eventually gets to the point where you have indicators that are actionable by business and government. So a government isn't going to have a policy for a temperature of 2.5 degree warming, but they can have a policy for a wide range of changes in risk to flood and heat wave and fire and pest and public health risk and potential changes to insurance and property damage and emergency management. So that supply chain can bring information to indicators that are actionable, and you can have specific plans, whether they be regulations or they can be design specifications or they could be new lines on a map or they can be something like a price on this or an incentive on that, a financial one. I think if we appreciate and visualize what this information supply chain looks like, then if we're a practitioner, I would hope that practitioners could see themselves in it, whether it's part of somebody's research project or whether it's them actually being able to take it on as part of their practice, as part of the service they offer to their clients, whether their clients are in government or in the private sector. And I think that becomes very important in making climate change information actionable so that governments can design and implement adaptation measures as well as greenhouse gas mitigation measures.
Right.
So I think the idea of the climate change information supply chain is an important one. It's part of what I talk about in my course at Royal Roads. And I think it's something that will just empower us as we understand where we fit in it.
Right. Now, if some people, they don't want to be just spectators, they want to jump in the game, they'd like to do climate change adaptation as a profession. Now, it could be a high school student thinking of a future career or somebody middle-aged who wants to shift over to climate change adaptation. I'm wondering, what kind of advice would you offer people like that?
Well, I think, we are fortunate that the internet has developed to a point where the amount of information about education opportunities is now a lot easier to find. So, when I was looking to start working on climate change in the 1980s, none of this existed. So
right.
It was a bit of an accident that I was able to get started on this career 35 years ago. But today, I think there are more opportunities to find these entry points. If you're, say, in high school and you're looking for a university that actually has climate change programs, you have a few more that are beginning to do this. So I mentioned that Royal Roads is going to start theirs in 2021, but Waterloo already has one. I believe McMaster University in Canada already has one. You mentioned several, like Griffiths in Australia and London.
Yeah, and there's one in the, I think, New Brunswick has a bachelor program.
Yeah, I think there's also one at the University of Prince Edward Island, too. So if you're in high school, you can start looking around for that. Universities are finally beginning to post programs and courses with the word climate change in the title, which makes it searchable. It wasn't that long ago that you couldn't find climate change in the title of anything at a university.
It was just like sustainability or environmental science or environmental studies.
Yeah, that is what it was. And there are overlaps between climate change and sustainability, but they really are not the same. And I think to have climate change in the title, I think is just a tremendous breakthrough in terms of our ability to educate ourselves on the issue training, So we need to establish what are the kinds of core things that we want an undergraduate to understand as they draw in the specialized training they may be picking up, say, in engineering or in forestry or in environmental studies or urban planning. I think it's good that universities are beginning to organize that and being explicit about having climate change in the title of their programs and courses. So high school students now are able to see that if they look around and try to decide what university I want to go to. And I would like to think that that's an incentive for public school boards to start adding climate change topic in the senior levels of high school, to at least begin to introduce this to them, not just in science classes. I mean, certainly I would like to see it happen in science classes, but I would certainly like to see it happen in the social science side as well, because this is a very human issue, climate change, and there are human aspects of it that are worth introducing. So it'd be great to see a learning module in senior high school, both on the natural science and the social science side, to introduce them to the topic. And then when it comes to people who are already working in fields of practice, look around for opportunities for professional development And if you don't have them in your profession, you should ask your association, why not? Why isn't it there? So we have, the Royal Roads program, its initial impetus was to try to reach practitioners in an organized way. And so having a 4-week online course is meant to be as convenient as possible. But to see professional development being offered by engineering associations or accounting associations or others in different fields of finance, or in different biological science fields like in forestry or in water management certification, planning.
Exactly.
So if it's not there, if you're in a field of practice and your professional association is not offering a professional development course to you, I think you should ask the question to the association, why aren't you doing that? Because some are, and I think it would be great to elevate this as an issue worth having, professional development, learning opportunities for people who are already in their careers in different fields of practice.
Right. And my hope for example, the field of disaster risk reduction, for emergency management, is to get that into the curriculum of schools that are teaching emergency management throughout Canada, US, and around the world, not to tiptoe around the topic. Oh, we don't want to talk about climate change because there are a few people working as emergency managers in certain corporations, and they don't believe in climate change. Well, I think we should be very far beyond that, and we need to hit this topic straight on. So anyway, that's just my opinion for emergency management.
I agree with that. I agree with that very much, and I think you can strategically do this by finding the right people who understand the intersection between the two and can speak to it at a technical level. If we are going to have knowledge sharing, it has to be knowledge sharing at a technical level where you've got people who are able to cross those boundaries and able to present technical information that is understandable on both sides of those boundaries.
Right. Right. And to try to avoid being like politicized. I mean, it is political, but we don't want people, two sides, just being emotional about it and not looking, as Greta Thunberg, the Swedish activist, says, we need to look to the science. We can't just let emotion overcome us or political interest. It has to be science, because this is a matter of survival. So
but that's what's so great. That's what's so great about Greta Thunberg. She is speaking to the whole issue of intergenerational equity, for older people to understand that if you're in high school right now, you look out ahead 30 or 40 years and you're just middle age. So this scenario as it plays out is hitting you over pretty well your entire adult life. You have a different perspective on time than someone who is older. But the fact that her message is a science-based message, she says, I don't know the science yet, but I'm beginning to read it. And I'm telling everyone, you've got to listen to the science and act urgently on the basis of the science. And that's a different message from what we have heard in the past from other environmental activists who have not had a science-based message, at least one as clearly and concisely as Greta has. And that's why I think her message is resonating with so many people, and why she is getting the opportunity to speak to some fairly important adult groups like the World Economic Forum, or the plenary of the Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or Senate committees in the U.S. I mean, her success has been because of that message, as well as because of the fact that she's a youth. And it's attracting an awful lot of people. And it is seen as a political challenge that those that want to block climate change policy for their own reasons. And so the way they treat her is to insult her and disrespect her as much as possible. And the fact that she's had to endure this, I tell you, she's got to have a lot of strength to be able to endure those kinds of attacks. And this is the kind of thing that we somehow have to get past. We have to get past the polarization. And it's only going to happen if we treat the fossil fuel industry as a potential partner, and if we ask them to be part of the planning to get us to a low carbon future, and if we're serious about this, because I think that, if you want a serious relationship with someone, you don't start off with it by hurling disrespect at them. But yeah, exactly. We've just, in the last number of years, it seems that the norm has been to promote polarization and disrespect rather than collaboration and negotiation and finding the best compromise that offers the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which is what I thought politics was supposed to do. But we seem to have lost the ability to do that. We have to somehow find it again.
Right. And if we've done it with COVID-19, we should be able to do it with climate change.
Well, that's what I think. And in effect, this is Greta's message. She's just saying, listen to the science and act with urgency on that basis. That, I think, is a powerful message that bears repeating, and it bears repeating accurately. Don't distort it just because you don't want that message to resonate in the governments of the world, but also in the financial investors of the world. Don't distort the message. That is what the message is. And let's see if we can build a new dialogue on the basis of demonstrating respect for science. Because
right.
in effect, this is where we are. We are here because science communicated a message on the basis of data and observations, which seems to be bearing out. We are getting reinforcement of that all the time. And that means we have to take it seriously, even if it means we have to change something that we have become comfortable and we believed in for decades. There's this little phrase that I used in one of my own blog posts a little while ago, which was that the horse and buggy age didn't end because we ran out of horses. They got replaced by cars because cars were seen as a faster and cleaner alternative to horses. So now we have the situation with energy and how we use energy. In order for us to shift from a high carbon to a low carbon world, it has nothing to do with whether we're going to run out of oil or coal or not. That's
right.
not the reason. The reason is because science has told us we need to move from a high carbon to a low carbon world. So that's what we have to focus on, is how best to do that. And to do that because the technology is there that enables us to actually have a high quality of life in a low carbon world. So
right.
That's why I think we should have a conversation that says, how do we get there, and how do we bring the fossil fuel industry with us there so that they can shift their investment and they can shift their employment, and so people aren't losing. We don't want losers here. We want everyone to be in the same boat when we get to the other side of the rapids.
Right. So, Stewart, we're coming to the end of our podcast here. And I'm just wondering, is there one last thing that you would like to leave with our listeners?
Well, I think that being able to see yourself in this, I think is the important thing. I think there is enough information out there now about educational opportunities at all age and experience levels, and also within the political arena. There are opportunities for all of us to become part of this in some way, because the issue of climate change is now more visible than it's ever been before, and there are more entry points. Each one of us can find our own particular entry point to become engaged in this, and don't think that an action like reducing your own personal carbon footprint is too small. It's definitely not. There is value to that. And don't think that you have nothing to say about reducing community vulnerability to something like fire and flood. You have something to say about that too. So look for a place, look for an entry point to see yourself in there, because I think they're out there, and I think that's going to be of great value to all of us as we try to figure out how we manage climate change as we go forward.
Right. And I just like to tell the listeners, there's a proverb. It says, if you can't go through the door, try the window. So sometimes you don't know how you get in the game. You don't know where your entry point is. Sometimes you just have to make one. This is not a promotion to go and burglarize houses through windows, but it's just a proverb saying that there is a way. You've got to find the way. And if you can't find the way, make a way. So thank you so much, Stewart. I really appreciate you participating in this multi-hazards interview. And you're very, very important part of this conversation about climate change and mitigation adaptation. Thank you so much, Stewart.
Thank you, Vin. It was a pleasure.
Okay. Have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So there we are. That's the interview. Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen, for being a guest here at the Multi-Hazards podcast. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our guests have too. So a little disclaimer here before we go. I add it to the end of each and every episode these days, and it is, this podcast is meant to be educational, and we don't try here to offer legal, medical, or other specific advice unless otherwise noted. And also, the opinions that we express here, either me, the host, or the guest, they do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that we belong to. So, as I wrap up this episode, I want to thank each one of you, my listeners, for tuning in. Stay safe out there, and stay tuned for more. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.